Hi, I'm Tony Alexander, and I'm a professor of geography at Auburn University in the Department of Geology and Geography. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how geography, or more specifically Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, are used to address hunger issues at both an international level and a local level. So if we start off, we actually want to come in and get some idea of this kind of term, geographic. What is geography? For most of us, the last time we had a geography class might have been 7th grade, or maybe it was when you were in 4th grade and did that state report, or 5th grade and did the country report. For the most part, a large part of their experience with geography has to do with it's about memorizing capitals and countries. And that's not to say geography isn't part of that, but really one of the significant things about geography today is that it's more about how it all fits together. So we want to take a look at what does the word literally mean. If we go back and we look at the word geo and graphy, we break it down and you have geo is earth, and then we get to graphy, which is a written description, which is very different than maybe that term geology. While we're related disciplines, geology is the study of the physical earth. Geography, as you can see, is a written description of the earth. And that typically means that it's referring to parts of the earth on the surface of the earth for the most part. And so we could certainly come in and we could catalog everything as we've seen before with memorizing those capitals and countries. And perhaps we could even talk about, bushels of wheat grown or bales of hay or how much corn we produced last year. But today, how that all fits together is we want to understand how these characteristics tie together across space. And so today we might describe geography as a study of spatial variation and spatial interaction, understanding how it all fits together. How does something that happens in one part of the world influence or is impacted by something that goes on in another part of the world? So how does geography apply to hunger? Right? Geography is primarily concerned with these spatial relationships of food, but as they relate to 3 different levels. The first one we might talk about with geographies of food or geographies of hunger is geographers may look at things like agricultural production or food production. What types of things might we look at? We could certainly look at agricultural patterns. We could look at climate. Certainly climate has an impact on what types of products you can grow where or produce where. And so that's the first level of it. The second level we might talk about is the distribution of food. If geography is about relating things to each other across space, we have to understand how sometimes issues of hunger and food are not simply an issue of amount of food available, but rather the distribution of it. Is it actually in the places that it needs to be to have the most impact? And the final one that we might talk about is consumption. And the consumption can range from consumer behavior patterns, what are our food preferences here in the US versus elsewhere in the world, or simply can't even include things like what about access to actual food, the amount of food that's available. So some of the basic concepts in geography that we have to understand include the notions of both absolute and relative as they relate to space and place for that matter. So if we start off, we want to think about at the most basic level, things that are absolute in terms of space have to do with measurement. So if we start off at one level, we can talk about absolute direction. So simply, what is absolute direction? It's mathematical measurement of space, which means it's the 4 cardinal points. Right? We can go north, south, west, and east. What about distance? How can we have mathematical distance? Well, that's pretty simple, right? By most accounts, we think of it in miles, feet, inches. It's the way most of us experience distance on a daily basis. And finally, we get to location. What is absolute location? It's that one that they taught you when you were probably in elementary school. It's mathematical measurement, which is latitude and longitude. Absolute location. Right? So if we look, certainly we can look up, and if we look at absolute location, we can see it from a global perspective. Our maximum latitude is going to be 90 degrees north. Our maximum latitude the other direction, 90 degrees south. And then certainly if we go east to west, we have our longitude, which runs 180 degrees in both directions. All measurements that are based on the core of the Earth or the center of the Earth. But frankly, if we think about it, how often are these the measurements? Are these the actual directions, distances, and locations that we think about on a daily basis? So what does it mean to have these from a relative perspective? Often a relative perspective has to do with understanding how location, distance, and direction can often be premised upon some other location, distance, or direction. So for example, relative direction, way out yonder. Next door, next to, beside, behind, right? What about distance? This is the one that we most often get interested in. So for example, if we want to know what the relative distance is, we might say that it's the distance based on time, or how we experience time. So now, think about it. For anybody that goes out driving and you go to MapQuest or you get on your navigation system and you want to know how far you're going, is our first instinct to look at any more at how many miles? Well, maybe, if you're conscious of your fuel consumption. But for me, the first thing I look at is how long. So distance, from a relative perspective, is distance as premised upon time, or our sense of how long it's relatively going to take us to get there. Along those same lines, relative location is also crucial to understanding how geography and hunger work. Relative location is not based on mathematics, but rather it's location relative to some other place. Specifically, in this case, we could say it's next to, by, beyond, right? We could say that, what's my relative location? Well, I could give you my address. I could tell you it's 200 Main Street. But really what I might tell you is, well, do you know where that gas station is? Yeah, well, I live 2 houses over from that. That's relative location. And that's the location that often determines how we interact. As you can see, relative location is often based on perception or how we interpret barriers, and so it becomes very important to also understanding the impacts of hunger. So what if we take a quick look and start kind of breaking down some of the ideas that go with hunger? We might look at things like comparative caloric intake. Right? If we come in here and we look at our comparative caloric intake, we can get some idea of what are the highest caloric intakes on Earth. Right? If we look back, we can get it at the top of the heap. It's the United States. It's estimated that, well, with an average consumption of 3,699 calories a day, we're meeting 154% of our needed requirements. Contrast that, on the other hand, with Somalia at the bottom. At 1,566 calories a day, it's only 65% of the required needs. And much of that is coming from food aid, or a third of that's coming from external aid. So we can look at this and see the full spectrum, and obviously we see some general patterns here, right? In this tabular format, we look at it and we see things like we see the US, Portugal, Greece, Belgium, Ireland, all the way down to Italy and Cyprus, all exceeding 100% of our daily requirements. Contrast that then with Haiti, right? Or any of these others, 79 to 65% of the necessary calories. So we can look at it in a tabular format, but frankly, geography is a very visual discipline. And so what if we take similar data and we transform it into the spatial relationships? In this case, we're looking at per capita average calories available daily as a percent of need. So this can be often much more impactful. That we often respond to things much more visually presented in this format, in this case a map showing the relative impacts. We can look at some general patterns. Obviously, where are the lowest levels of people meeting their daily needs are less than 90%. Obviously, we can get into parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Right? What about the ones where people's needs are more than adequately met, more than 110%? We can come in and we can see areas of Western Europe. We can go in and look at the US. And even in parts of Asia, we come into play. So one of the things about geography is that it can offer this spatial perspective to understand why is it these patterns exist? Why is it that people in sub-Saharan Africa are more likely to suffer from malnutrition or food vulnerability than elsewhere in the world? So based on this, you might get some sense that geography because it's about space and it's a very visual discipline, maps have become a really important part of geography. And if we want a general definition of a map, we might say it's a representation or portrayal of the environment with a specific intent. Okay? One of the general rules for maps is that maps all have a particular purpose. No map can show you everything, and no map should. We know that maps are a guideline. They're a way that we interact with the natural environment and give us some kind of understanding of it and allow us to relate to how we relate to the rest of the world. So if we look at it, we can see that maps provide a reduction of reality, that simplify things so that we can see the things that are the most important to us. So we know it's a simplification of reality and a symbolization of reality. If we look at this map here that we have in the picture, we notice that it's essentially a topographic map. Right? It shows topography, the surface of the landscape. And it's a very particular map. Its intent is to show us elevation, to show us development, to show us urbanization. But as you notice, it doesn't show us everything. It provides us with roadways and some building structures and some streets, but certainly it doesn't show us everything. There's no need. There's no need to show us every single building. There's no need to show us every single small road, because that's not what a topographic map is intended to do. The same thing comes along with the symbolization. Symbolization is important because there are certain ways that we perceive space, and the maps need to go along with that, or we risk not being understood properly. So in this case, to understand that what some of the most important things are, we symbolize them. And we may symbolize them at a different scale than what perhaps they really are. So our roads may appear a little bit thicker than they really are on Earth. They're not completely to scale. Right? We also use some common symbols to understand the world. For example, what color do we normally see bodies of water? Well, you could respond, well, that's easy, it's blue. But we know in reality not all water is blue. If you've ever been to the lower part of the Mississippi River, you'd find out that it's often pretty brown. But we still use blue because that's the common conception that we have in the symbolization, and it conveys the information we want to show each other. So with that in mind, we start thinking about all these aspects that geography can provide. They can provide a symbolization and an understanding of how relative locations and relative directions and distances all play into the production, distribution, and consumption of food in the world. So it leads us to this idea and asking ourselves, location, location, location. We certainly see location on a daily basis. We interact with it all the time. For most of us, we don't even think about it anymore, right? We've got access to things like OnStar, right? We've got a Garmin in our car or a navigation system. Maybe you have a TomTom or a Magellan, right? Or even if we look at this, we've got our cell phones. Every cell phone today has a GPS unit in it. That's the commonality of all three of these things. OnStar, your navigation system, and the GPS unit in your cell phone all help provide location, location, location. And they're all a key part of geography. Geography's played a key component in understanding these different aspects of the world and this technology development. So what we want to do then is we want to think about, as we go forward, how do these technologies work and how can we use them to apply to issues related to hunger at a local to a global scale.